On the seventh
This
morning,
so-called
I was
Ferrari
standing
is
in the
nothing but
parking lot
scrap
of a
metal.
building that used to
I've seen
belong to
better
Helena
craftsmanship at a
Cross. It
junkyard.
was a
It's
Sunday
an
in
insult to real
February,
collectors.
cold the
Scrap
way Denver
metal.
gets cold in winter. Not dramatic, just settled and certain, the mountains visible at the end of South Broadway in the thin morning light. I had a cashier's check in my jacket pocket. My attorney was on the phone. The listing agent was walking toward me from the entrance of the building with her hand extended. Finn was beside me. He was 11 years old and he had his good jacket on, the navy one that his mother had bought him 2 sizes too large 2 years before she died, and that had finally fit him correctly in November, and which he wore to things that mattered without being asked.
No.
7 days earlier, on a Monday afternoon at the Meridian Collector Auctions preview event in Denver, Helena Cross had walked past the car I had spent 18 months building and said, to the client she was advising, loudly enough for the people around her to hear, that it was a burned-out shell with amateur coachwork, that the transition from the door to the rear quarter broke at the wrong point, and anyone who understood surface development would see it immediately, and that whoever had set the estimate had clearly never stood next to a real coach-built car in their life. She had said it in front of Finn, who was there because school was out for a holiday week and who had spent 18 months watching me build the rear quarter she was describing. She had also said it in front of a woman named Sasha Petrov, who said nothing in response, but who spent the next 40 minutes photographing the car with the focused attention of someone who had just heard an assessment she disagreed with completely and wanted to document why. 6 days after that, a wire transfer for $8 million cleared into my business account. The car Helena Cross had called amateur scrap metal had sold for more than any vehicle her dealership had ever handled in 23 years of operation. And now I was in her parking lot, and the listing agent was shaking my hand, and Finn was standing beside me looking at the building the way he looked at things he was deciding what to think about. He said, "Is this ours now?" I said, "By end of March." He looked at the building for another moment. Then he looked at me. He said, "Helena was wrong." I said, "Yes." He said, "She didn't know how to look." I said, "No, she didn't." He went back to looking at the building. I went back to the attorney on the phone. The listing agent was smiling in the way that listing agents smile when a cash offer at full asking price has been submitted, and the only question left is the paperwork. 18 months of work, 7 days, $8 million, one building. Let me tell you how it happened. I grew up in Globeville, a neighborhood on the north side of Denver, older than most of the city, sitting between the South Platte River and the industrial corridor that runs along its banks. Not a fashionable neighborhood. A neighborhood where people had worked with their hands for a long time, and where the specific knowledge that comes from working with your hands was understood as knowledge and not dismissed as mere skill. My father, Thomas, had a body shop on the north end of the neighborhood for 31 years. 3 bays, 2 employees at the peak, work coming in from insurance companies and from the people who had driven past the shop for 20 years and trusted what they saw there. My father did not cut corners. He had a specific standard of finish that cost him more time than the insurance rate covered and that he maintained anyway because his name was on the work, and his name meant what he said it meant. He believed that a panel that was right could be felt before it was seen. That your hand told you things your eyes would miss, and that developing that sensitivity required working with metal for long enough that it stopped being a material and became something closer to a language. One that took years to learn and that you kept learning for the rest of your life. I grew up learning that language in the garage behind the shop. Not lessons. There was no formal instruction. I handed my father tools and watched and asked questions that he answered while working, which was the most effective form of teaching I ever received. By 14, I could work a panel without guidance. By 17, I could achieve a finish that my father brought clients in to see. I went to the Art Institute of Colorado for 2 years, industrial design, before leaving in 2003 to work full-time. My father had not wanted me to leave school. At 21, I could not adequately explain why the education I was receiving in the garage was the one that mattered. I understood it better later. I worked at a series of body shops from 2003 to 2008, accumulating the range of experience that specialization cannot give you. Structural repair, paint, metalwork, fabrication, the full vocabulary of what a vehicle's body can be shaped into if the person shaping it knows what they are doing. In 2008, I went to work for Del Whitmore. Del was 65 years old in 2024 and had spent nearly 4 decades as a master coach builder, the last 20 of those years running his own shop in a converted warehouse in Denver's Reno neighborhood, where he built 1 or 2 bespoke vehicles per year for private clients who had the patience to wait and the resources to pay for work done at the pace that doing it correctly required. He was not famous outside a specific world. Inside that world, his name meant something definitive and without qualification. I worked for Del from 2008 to 2012. 4 years of the most concentrated professional education of my life. Del taught me not just technique but philosophy, that a coach-built car was not a modified production vehicle but a sculpture that moved, that every surface had to be considered in relationship to every other surface, that the distance between good metalwork and extraordinary metalwork was not a matter of skill but of intention, and that intention was the thing that could not be taught directly, only recognized and then cultivated in the person who already had it. On my last day at his shop, he handed me a leather-bound sketchbook and said, "Fill that, then build what's in it." I opened Mercer Coachworks in 2012 at 30 years old in a leased space in Denver's industrial corridor, a small operation, myself and 1 other fabricator, eventually 2. I built 3 bespoke vehicles in the first 5 years, each one better than the last. Each one documented by Del, who came to the shop periodically and looked at the work with the attention of a man who had spent his life looking at metalwork and could see the distance between what it was and what it needed to be. I met Laura in 2009. We married in 2011. Finn was born in 2013. Laura died in August 2019 from pancreatic cancer, 6 months from the diagnosis call to the end. Finn was 6 years old. I closed the shop for a month. Then I opened it again because Finn needed a father who was functioning, and because the shop was the one place in my life where every problem had a solution if you were patient and precise enough to find it. Finn grew up at Mercer Coachworks the way I had grown up at my father's shop, not adjacent to the work, but inside it. He had a stool near the metalwork area that he occupied on Saturdays and school holidays with his sketchbook and his homework, and the occasional question that stopped me mid-operation because it required a real answer. By 11, he could feel the difference between a panel that was right and one that was almost right, not always in words, but in the thing his hand told him when he ran it across a surface, which was the same thing his grandfather had known, and which had apparently decided to skip 1 generation before appearing in Finn. Finn called the shop the studio. He had called it that since he was old enough to understand what studios were for. I had never corrected him. It was, in the most accurate sense, precisely what it was. I purchased the donor car, a 1969 Ferrari 365 GT2+2, at a Copart salvage auction in March 2022 for $42,000. The car had been in a garage fire the previous year. The body was destroyed, buckled and burned and structurally compromised at every panel. The chassis was intact. The drivetrain, a 4.4-liter V12 engine and 5-speed transaxle, was damaged but restorable. The suspension was sound. The fundamental architecture of one of Ferrari's most celebrated platforms from its most celebrated era was present underneath the ruin of what had been its skin. I had bought it for the bones. I spent 3 months restoring the mechanical components before I touched the body. Engine rebuild, transaxle rebuild, suspension overhaul, all done with the same standard I applied to everything that came through the shop, which was the standard my father had applied and that I had not found any reason to revise in 20 years of working. Del came during this period and looked at the chassis on its stand and the drivetrain laid out on the bench and said, "This is the right foundation. Now what are you going to put on it?" I showed him the drawings. I had been designing the body for 6 months before I bought the chassis, developing a form in the leather sketchbook Del had given me in 2012. The design referenced the proportions and philosophy of 1960s Italian coach building without reproducing any specific historical vehicle. The drawings were precise and extensive, hundreds of pages of elevations, section views, surface development studies, detail studies of specific junctions and transitions. The drawings of the rear 3/4 alone ran to 37 pages. Del looked at the sketchbook for a long time. He turned pages with the deliberate pace of someone who was actually reading what was there rather than skimming it for an impression. He said, "The rear 3/4 is the hard part. You know that." I said, "I know." He said, "Show me how you're going to do it." I showed him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Build it." The build took 18 months. I worked on it in the mornings before the shop opened and on evenings and weekends, not rushing it, not treating it as a side project, treating it as the central work around which everything else was organized. The aluminum panels were formed using the English wheel, the planishing hammer, and by hand, the shaping that turned flat sheet into curved surface through a process that was neither mechanical nor accidental but something between those two things that had no clean name. Finn was present for most of it. He watched panels being formed from flat sheet into the surfaces that the drawings described. He watched the fitting process, how each panel was positioned against the chassis and the adjacent panels and checked and adjusted and checked again until the relationship between surfaces was what it needed to be. He watched the rear quarter being worked and reworked over 6 weeks in the spring of 2023 until it achieved what it needed to achieve. He asked me once, watching a panel being worked on the English wheel, why I didn't use a machine to produce the form directly. I said, "A machine gives you the surface it was programmed to give. A hand gives you the surface the metal wants to be." He thought about this. Then he said, "How do you know what the metal wants?" I said, "You listen." He went back to his sketchbook and made a note. He did not ask any more questions about it that day. He was the kind of person who took something in and worked with it before he needed more. Dell came to the shop in November 2023 and looked at the car, fully formed, primed, not yet in final paint but in the state where the form could be read cleanly without color to distract from it. He walked around it 3 times. He crouched at the rear quarter. He stood back and looked at the car from the distance at which a car reveals what it actually is rather than what it appears to be close up. He said, "The rear 3/4. I said, "Yes." He said, "It's right." He had told me on 3 separate occasions what was wrong with it and why. He was telling me now that it was right. Dell did not use the word right casually. The car went into final paint in December. A deep midnight blue, a color I had chosen as a deliberate reference to the British and French coach-building tradition of the 1950s and 1960s that the design referenced, the kind of blue that absorbed light rather than reflected it, that looked different at every hour of the day. The application was done in the way that era required, hand-polished to a depth that modern spray and clear finishes approached but did not reach. The car was completed in January 2024. I entered it in the February Meridian Collector Auctions Denver event. Listed as a 1969 Ferrari 365 GT2+2 with bespoke coachwork by Mercer Coachworks, Denver, Colorado. Catalog estimate $180,000 to $250,000, based on the donor car's base value as a Ferrari Classic. I had my own understanding of what the car was worth. I was prepared to be patient about how that understanding became shared. Helena Cross had founded Cross Prestige Automotive in Denver in 2001 at 35 years old. 23 years of operation. Showrooms in Denver, Boulder, and Colorado Springs handling European luxury and American collectibles. A reputation in the Colorado automotive market built on volume, presentation, and the specific social currency of being the address where a certain kind of Colorado buyer went for a certain kind of car. She was not a craftsperson. She was a dealer. She understood markets, presentation, and the psychology of luxury transactions. These were real skills that had built a real business. They were not the skills that allowed you to look at a hand-formed aluminum panel and understand what you were looking at. Her Denver flagship location on South Broadway had been quietly listed for sale since October 2023. A commercial real estate decision, the building was owned by the business and was carrying costs that made more sense to liquidate. Asking price, $3.2 million. I'd heard about the listing in December. I'd driven past the building once, not stopping. I'd not told anyone why I drove past it. The Meridian Collector Auctions Denver Preview event was held on the afternoon of Monday, February 12th in 2024. The preview floor held approximately 60 people, collectors, dealers, industry contacts, serious buyers, and the people who accompanied serious buyers. I walked the car through its paces for the attendees who stopped, answering questions about the construction, the donor chassis, the design process. Some of them understood what they were looking at immediately. Some seemed confused by how low the estimate was relative to the quality of the execution. I did not explain the discrepancy. It would become clear. Finn was with me. School was out for a holiday week. He was in the navy jacket, carrying his sketchbook, making drawings of the cars that interested him and ignoring the ones that didn't. The Ferrari interested him. He had made 6 drawings of it from different angles by the time Helena arrived. Helena arrived at the preview at 3:30 p.m. with 2 members of her staff and a client, a Boulder-based technology executive she was advising on his first significant collector car purchase. She moved through the preview floor with the efficiency of someone who had attended many of these events and had developed a rapid triage system for what deserved attention. She stopped at the Ferrari. She looked at it for approximately 45 seconds. She walked around it once. She looked at the catalog entry. She looked at the car again. Then she said, to her client, loudly enough for the 4 or 5 people in the immediate vicinity to hear, that it was a burned-out shell with amateur coachwork, that the transition from the door to the rear quarter broke at the wrong point, and anyone who understood surface development would see it immediately, and that whoever had set the estimate had clearly never stood next to a real, coach-built car in their life. She said it the way people say things when they are performing expertise rather than exercising it, when the words are arranged for the audience rather than for the truth. Finn was standing beside me. He was 11 years old and he had spent 6 weeks in the spring of 2023, watching the rear quarter she was describing be formed, adjusted, and refined until Del Whitmore, who had spent nearly 4 decades looking at metalwork and did not use the word right casually, had stood back from it in November and said it was right. Finn looked at Helena. He looked at me. He did not say anything. My expression did not change. I turned back to the collector I had been speaking with before Helena's arrival and continued the conversation I had been having, which was about the surface development studies in the sketchbook and why the transition from the door to the rear quarter had required 37 pages of drawing to resolve. Helena moved on to the next lot. One of her staff looked back at the car with an expression that was not quite the expression Helena had intended. In the 3rd row of the preview floor, 12 feet from where this had happened, a woman named Sasha Petrov was photographing the rear quarter with focused and systematic attention. Sasha was 44 years old and had been brokering private sales of significant art and collector vehicles for 16 years. She worked with 12 active clients whose combined holdings in art and automotive objects ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. She was not publicly known. She was specifically known by the people she needed to be known by. She spent 40 minutes with the car after Helena left. She photographed every panel from every angle with the documentary thoroughness of someone who needed to communicate what she was seeing to a person who was not in the room. She got close to the metalwork. She ran her hand along the rear quarter, the one Helena had criticized, and felt what was there. Then she went outside and called Edward Brown. Edward was 71 years old and lived outside Zurich. He had been commissioning and collecting bespoke automotive objects for 20 years. Not production cars, not standard collector vehicles, but genuinely one-of-a-kind pieces that existed at the intersection of automotive engineering and sculptural form. He had 6 vehicles in a climate-controlled facility outside Zurich that collectively represented some of the most significant private coach-building work of the past 2 decades. He was also a man who had learned, over 20 years of working with Sasha, to hear something specific in her voice when she called about something she had seen. He heard it now. He asked her 2 questions. She answered both. He said he would look at the photographs when they arrived and call her back. He called back 4 hours later. He said, "I want to speak with the builder." Sasha called me the following morning, Tuesday, February 13th. She explained who she was and who her client was and what her client had said. She asked if I would be willing to take a direct call from Edward Brown. I was at the workbench when she called. Finn was at school. I looked at the leather sketchbook sitting at the edge of the bench where it had been since the Ferrari went into storage for the auction. I looked at it for a moment. I said, "Tell him I'll be available this afternoon." Edward called at 2 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. in Zurich. He spoke for 12 minutes. He described what Sasha had shown him and what he believed he was looking at. He was precise. He demonstrated in 12 minutes that he understood the work at the level that the work deserved to be understood. Then he said, "What do you want for it?" I'd carried the number since the day in November when Dell had stood back from the rear quarter and said it was right. It was not the auction estimate. I said the number, $8 million. Edward said, "I'll have my people call your people today." I said, "I don't have people." A pause. Then Edward said, "Find someone by tomorrow." I called Dell that evening. Dell listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then he said, "8 million. I said, "Yes." He said, "I told you in November the rear quarter was right." I said, "You did." He said, "Get a lawyer." I called my attorney that evening. By the following morning, the legal framework for the private sale was in place. The car was withdrawn from the Meridian Collector Auctions Denver event. The auction house handled it professionally, as auction houses do when a significantly better outcome for the consignor has emerged through other means. The wire transfer cleared on Friday, February 17th. I was in the shop when the notification arrived on my phone. I looked at it for a long time. Then I called Finn's school and asked them to let him know his father would be picking him up that afternoon. He came out at 3:15 and saw my truck at the curb. He got in. He looked at me. He said, "Did it sell?" I said, "Yes." He said, "For how much?" I told him. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the windshield at the February afternoon. The thin Colorado winter light, the mountains at the end of the street, Denver going about its ordinary Friday. Then he said, "Helena was wrong." I said, "Yes." He said, "She didn't know how to look." I looked at him. He was 11 years old and he had spent 18 months watching something be built that a woman with 23 years in the automotive business had dismissed in 45 seconds, and he had understood from the moment she dismissed it that she was not seeing what was there. I said, "No, she didn't." We drove home. On Saturday morning, I called my attorney. I told him about the South Broadway listing, the Cross Prestige flagship location, asking price $3.2 million, on the market since October. I told him I wanted to make an offer that day. He asked if I wanted to negotiate or move quickly. I said, "Move quickly." The offer was submitted by noon. Full asking price, cash, 30-day close, no financing contingency, a 5-day review period that I intended to use efficiently. That afternoon, I drove to the building with Finn. We parked across South Broadway and sat in the truck and looked at it. 3 stories, ground floor showroom, upper floors with offices and service space, the kind of building that had been a statement when it was built and that was now, for reasons that had more to do with Helena's portfolio decisions than with the building itself, available. Finn said, "What are you going to do with it?" I said, "Expand the shop. There's enough space for a proper coach building facility. Metalwork, fabrication, paint, all in one building. Room for 3 or 4 builds running at once instead of one." Finn looked at the building. He said, "Is that enough room?" I said, "For now." He looked at it for another moment. Then he said, "Can I have a workspace in it?" I looked at him. "What kind of workspace?" He said, "Somewhere I can draw, and maybe start learning the wheel." I looked at the building. I thought about a 14-year-old in a North Denver body shop learning to work a panel under his father's supervision. I thought about what it had meant to be in a place where the learning was serious and the standards were real, and the only distance that mattered was the distance between where you were and where the work required you to be. I said, "Yes." He opened his sketchbook and made a note. The offer was accepted on Wednesday, February 21st. Helena Cross's attorney asked, in a call to my attorney, whether the buyer intended to continue automotive retail operations in the building. My attorney said the buyer intended to operate a coach building facility and workshop. There was a pause on the line. The attorney said he would pass that along. I found out later, through Sasha, that Helena had learned the identity of the buyer on Wednesday afternoon. I did not know what she had said. Whatever it was belonged to that conversation and not to this story. The building was going to become what I had in mind for it regardless. The close happened on March 20th, 2024. I walked through the building that morning with Dell. He had agreed to advise on the facility conversion. The knowledge of someone who had run a professional coach building operation for nearly 4 decades applied to the practical question of how to turn a luxury car showroom into a serious metalworking and fabrication space. Dell walked the ground floor, the old showroom now empty, the display lighting still on, the polished concrete floor reflecting it. He looked at the ceiling height. He looked at the ventilation. He looked at the electrical capacity on the service panel. He said, "You'll need to reinforce the floor in the rear section for the heavy equipment." I said, "Already on the list." He said, "The ceiling height in the main bay is good. You can get a proper rotisserie in there." I said, "That's why I wanted this building." He walked to the window and looked out at South Broadway. Denver doing what Denver does in late March, the mountains at the end of the street with the last of the winter snow still on them. He had watched me work for 16 years. He had watched the distance between what I could do and what the work required close, incrementally and without drama, over the full length of that time. He said, "Your father would have liked this building." I said, "He would have said the floor plan was wrong." Dell said, "He would have been right about something. Not necessarily that." I almost smiled. Dell said, "He still would have liked it." A Saturday morning in May 2024. The South Broadway facility was in conversion. The showroom floor cleared, heavy equipment partially in place, the rear section being modified for the metalwork bays. I was at a temporary workbench near the rear window reviewing the facility plans. Finn was in the corner of what would become his workspace, a cleared area near the north wall where I had set up a drawing table and beside it a small English wheel that Dell had brought from his own shop the previous week. Dell had been teaching Finn to use it on Saturday mornings. 3 weeks of Saturday mornings. Finn was not yet good at it. He was paying attention at the level that would make him good at it, which was the only thing that mattered at this stage. Dell was watching him from across the room. Finn was running a small aluminum test piece through the wheel, working it slowly, trying to feel what the metal was doing under the pressure, trying to understand the relationship between what he applied and what the material gave back. Dell said, "Feel it." Finn said, "I'm trying." Dell said, "Don't try. Feel it." Finn adjusted his grip. Something in his posture changed. A small shift, nearly imperceptible to someone not looking for it. He ran the piece through again. He took it out of the wheel and ran his hand across the surface and stopped. He looked at the piece. He looked at Dell. Dell said nothing. He just looked back. Finn looked at the piece again. Then he ran it through one more time. I was at the workbench across the room. I was not watching. I was looking at the facility plans, a pencil in my hand, making notes in the margin. But I heard the exchange, and I heard the silence that came after it, the specific quality of silence that is not absence but presence. A room where something is being understood, quietly, by someone with the patience to understand it. My father had taught me in a garage in Globeville. Dell had taught me in the Reno warehouse. I had built something in this city for 20 years that had arrived, 7 days and $8 million after a woman dismissed it in 45 seconds at this building and this morning and this moment. Finn was in the corner, working the piece through the wheel. He was learning to listen to the metal. The metal was beginning to answer. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Is there something you have been building, something that takes patience and intention and the willingness to let it take as long as it takes, that other people have looked at and not seen yet? Most extraordinary things look ordinary until the moment they don't. What are you building that hasn't been seen yet? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people. Real decisions. The kind that stay with you.